So one of Carlisle's grand theories is that vampires carry some trait from their human selves into their vampire lives, and it theoretically materializes and amplifies in their vampire selves, right? And this is separate from, though sometimes related to, talents and abilities, but not the same thing, because like Carlisle doesn't have an official gift, right? But he thinks all vampires have this specific trait thing, right? And when Edward is recounting this to Bella, he says Carlisle brought his compassion. Now, I don't necessarily think that Carlisle's theory is entirely off base, but do I think his foremost trait or the quality he supposedly carries into his vampire self is compassion? No. I would say it's not that, but not even quite self-control. More so self-restraint, but not even that, self-denial and repression. And it's fascinating because self-denial and guilt and repression is really embedded in Carlisle's history and his actions and his life and his choices, and I think that makes the most sense. Because for one thing, Carlisle doesn't have an official gift, according to Stephanie, but something we regard as being a special ability of his is his very impressive self-control, and he does have very impressive restraint when it comes to drinking human blood. And I think while there is an element and a guise of compassion on the surface, I think his ability to do that has a whole lot more to do with self-denial and guilt. And I think that's a prominent theme throughout Carlisle's entire history and backstory. He was the son of an Anglican pastor who was literally described as a self-righteous and compassionless man. And throughout Carlisle's life, his father led these crusades hunting vampires and witches. And he was very cruel, and he allowed many innocent people to be burned. And when he was too old to do it anymore, he quite literally passed the torch onto Carlisle, and he started leading these crusades, and this is how Carlisle gets turned into a vampire. So obviously his father and his upbringing instill a lot of guilt and fear and self-righteousness in Carlisle from the very beginning, right? Carlisle supposedly was not cruel and harsh in the way that his father was, but he discovered a coven of vampires living under the sewers, so he gathers hunters and waits for them to come out at night, and when one finally does, the vampire unalives two of the hunters, and Carlisle gets bitten. So he knows that anything that's infected by the monster is going to be burned, so he hides himself in a potato cellar, and he doesn't cry out the entire time throughout that extremely painful transformation. He's silent. And after his transformation, he realizes he's become the monster, and he's horrified, and he knows his father will revile him, so he tries to destroy himself, but obviously he's unsuccessful, so he tries to starve himself, and he doesn't feed at all. But these vampires cannot unalive by starvation. It's just extremely difficult and miserable for these vampires not to drink, especially for a newborn. So Carlisle just spends this time wallowing in self-pity, being lonely away from humans, but he persists. He denies the urge. He will not drink until one day he attacks a herd of passing deer, and that's how he discovers the vegetarian diet. And then the next significant part of Carlisle's backstory is when he comes across the Volturi, and Aro is absolutely fascinated with him, and Carlisle spends 20 years with these vampires who directly oppose his morals. He and Aro were absolutely fascinated with each other, and they definitely were not having a torrid affair. Aro just let that handsome vegetarian with no gift or useful ability stick around for 20 years and write laws just because. They were definitely not lovers, and they were definitely not exploring each other's bodies, and the Godfather made all his money selling olive oil, allegedly. And what's so interesting is during this whole time, we know canonically that Aro was always trying to get Carlisle to embrace his true nature. He was always testing him and prodding him with human blood and other things, I'm sure, trying to get him to drink. And the whole theme of this relationship with the Volturi and Aro in particular was, how could you deny yourself what you really are? And what a fascinating layered image of symbolism this paints. But Carlisle never did it. He never drank the blood. He never relented. And in the end, he didn't stay with Aro. What did he do? He set off to America, found a wife and a son, played Sims, and created a creepy undead nuclear family, and became their righteous leader, husband, and father, tells them what to do, this is how we live, and punishes them if they fail, because that's what he was supposed to do, that's what he has to do. Is this compassion? Carlisle's actions are not compassionate. The man is morally bankrupt. He's a wealth-hoarding billionaire who deliberately causes harm to a small community, dooms multiple people to an existence he himself describes as agony and damning, then shames them for the nature of what he made them, solely for his own selfish purposes, also knowing that the people he turns will in all likelihood unalive many other people, and they all have. He violates autonomy and legal, ethical, and moral codes constantly for his own weird desires and curiosity. He doesn't drink human blood though, and he works as a doctor. Is this solely about compassion? Or is it about guilt, self-righteousness? He has to be up close and personal with humans and blood. He has to prove he's not a monster. He can do it. In light of his other actions, is his capacity for restraint really about compassion, or is it about that? Keeping his creepy human cosplay cult in such close proximity with humans ultimately endangers them and causes more destruction than anything, as we see unfold with the events of the Twilight Saga. Not least of all in the form of his darling and most favorite son, who he crafted to follow in his very own footsteps, whose whole relationship with Bella is about proving that he's not a monster and has a soul. Edward endangers Bella constantly, forces proximity with her, chooses to stay in Forks, breaks into her bedroom every night to get used to her scent so as not to disappoint Carlisle, so as to prove that he can do it. He's not a monster. He can live pressed up against his greatest temptation and deny himself, whatever that means for her and the surrounding community. I think the behaviors we see in Carlisle and then subsequently in Edward demonstrate that they have less to do with compassion than we are led to believe, and that any trait or gift or ability that exists within a vampire exists to serve themselves and to make them better predators or protect themselves. And in all his self-denial, I would say Carlisle is ultimately just as selfish as his father was, just in a different font. And talk about the apple doesn't fall far from the tree with Glitter Clown. It's the circle of self-righteous white men.